So welcome to the second webinar of the series, Women's Ideas in the History of Medicine, which is jointly sponsored by the Center for the Study of Medicine and the Body in the Renaissance, CSMBR, and the Center for the Study of Women Philosophers and Scientists at Paderborn University. I'm Fabrizio Bigotti, Director of the CSMBR and co-organizer of this event along with Dr. Gilles Muller, and I'm happy to introduce the talk Anna Margaretha Wiedemann, a healing woman and a patient in early modern Frankfurt. As we begin this talk, I would like to remind everyone to silence themselves so as to allow the smoothest interaction online. If you wish to interact with us, please make sure to check the position of the button, raise your hand in the lower Zoom ribbon, and you will then be allowed to address your query to the speaker. Without further ado, I'm very glad to introduce our keynote speaker today, Jana Schreiber. Jana Schreiber studied history in Marburg and Bonn and currently works as a research assistant at the Department of Early Modern History at Philipps Universität Marburg under Professor Inken Schmidt-Voges. Her research interests are primarily in the social and cultural history of early modern medicine, as well as the body, gender, sexuality, and emotions in the early modern period. Further to academic activities, she is taking part in a blog project on early modern history and participates in a museum for the cultural and literary history of Romanticism. Focusing on the Barbers Guild in the 17th century, her PhD studies conflicts and complementarity between healers in early modern Frankfurt. Jana, welcome.
Thank you so much, Jill and Fabrizio, for your invitation. I'm very pleased to give my talk as a part of this lecture series, and I'm looking forward to your suggestions and questions afterwards. In the autumn of 1670, Johann Hebner, a courtier of Windeck, testified to Frankfurt Council about the healing skills of the maid Anna Margaretha Wiedemann. He described large open wounds in his mouth that had been treated by many barber surgeons so far. However, as the following quote shows, he was not satisfied with the treatments. I confess that I have taken many barber surgeons' remedies, none of it helped. After having received Wiedemann's treatment for 15 weeks, he was confident of his cure. He especially emphasizes that her therapy was painless. This example already tells us a lot about everyday medical life, and above all about the relationship between healers and their patients in the early modern period. Many patients visited several healers during the course of their illness. They sought second and third opinion, tried out different healing methods, and canceled treatments if they were dissatisfied with the results. And this can be observed in my sources, even with less affluent patients. The role of patients, as I think you can guess from this example already, naturally led to competition between healers for the favor of their patients. This was not only about the supremacy of knowledge, but also about economic resources. Which healing methods were considered effective, which conditions were considered sick, and which considered healthy was therefore not decided by the healers alone, but also by their patients. In order to investigate the relationship between patients and healers, but also their interpretations of illness, healing, and health, sources are needed that document this everyday practice of medicine. However, such sources are extremely rare, and even rarer are records of female healers and their patients, which provide insights into the medical practice and also pass on assessments of the therapeutic methods from the patient's perspective. This makes the case of the healer Anna Margaretha Wiedemann even more exciting. On the one hand, it outlines the educational background, knowledge, treatment methods, and patience of a woman who worked as a professional healer in the 17th century. The documents also provide an insight into conflicts between female healers and male professionals working in the medical field. In addition to professional disputes, there are many other different topics of conflicts that are negotiated. For example, gender, origin, denomination, sexuality, and the lifestyle of women. Finally, There are also interpretations and concepts of illness, healing, and health of healers and their patients, which will be the focus of today's paper. I discovered this case during my archival research in the Frankfurt City archives for my PhD thesis, which I'm currently working on. I've already analyzed most of the documents, but work on this chapter is still ongoing, so I would therefore be very happy to receive your feedback later on. Before I come back to Anna Margaretha Wiedemann, I would like to mention a few words about my PhD thesis, in which this case will also play a leading role. Taking the Frankfurt barber surgeon skills as an example, my thesis explores the negotiation and transformation processes of social order in early modern period. In other words, I'm looking at conflicts between barber surgeons, for example, between barber surgeons themselves, between barber surgeons and other competing medical professions, between barber surgeons and the council as the city authorities, and of course, between barber surgeons and their patients. But I'm also interested in cooperative practices. The medical field in the early modern period is very well suited as an example for analyzing transformation processes of social order. As we can see here, it was a very socially diversified field in which medical practitioners with different social and economic status, different training, and both men and women practice medicine. There are the barber surgeons who practice surgery as a guild of craftsmen. Then, of course, the academically trained physicians. The group of lay healers consists of many women who practice domestic medicine. The pharmacists who are responsible for the dispensary of remedies are next in line. Frankfurt had a large Jewish community in early modern period, which is why Jewish physicians also play a big part of the medical field. Midwives cared for pregnant women, but also treated sick women and children. Last but not least, there were the bathhouse keepers who provided bloodletting, cupping, and treated skin diseases in their bathhouses. The questions I focus on in my PhD thesis are: what factors influence the rank and status of the barber surgeons, like training, knowledge, networks, the personal behavior of individuals? What practices of differentiation and adaptation did they use? How did external circumstances affect them? By this, I mean above all epidemics and wars with many injured people who had to be treated. I'm also looking at the barber surgeons' strategies for dealing with different situations. For example, did they try to maintain or improve their social and economic position within the city medical professions, and in what ways? The testimonies and other documents from court records and complaints that I work with illuminate the barber surgeon's actions and provide insights into medical life. Early modern treatises and textbooks are therefore a little less in the spotlights of my work. But now I would like to jump straight back to the case of today's paper. Anna Margaretha Wiedemann came to Frankfurt in around 1663 as a maid and entered the service of the sack maker Junker Holzhausen. She claims to have worked as a maid for a famous physician before coming to Frankfurt. As she writes, he had neither servants nor children himself, which is why she helped him prepare medicines and treat wounds. Unfortunately, I have not been able to find out anything more about this famous physician. She confidently attributes her extensive knowledge of medicine to this training path. So she states, I quote, "There are few barber surgeons like myself who have seriously acquired such a knowledge." As it is clear from several documents, she had already treated sick people during her time as a maid in Frankfurt. In 1670, she decided to do this full-time and submitted a supplement to the Frankfurt Council on 16th of June. The council granted her permission to practice as long as she did not take any patients away from the barber surgeons. However, after one of her patients, the draper Caspar Gabriel Braumann, died during her treatment, his widow and the Frankfurt Barber Surgeons Guild brought lawsuit against Wiedemann. The council and Wiedemann herself then obtained statements from many of her patients. Some of them were still undergoing treatment at the same time of the testimonies, while others had already completed their therapy. In March 1671, the relative of another deceased patient again filed a lawsuit against her before the council. The deceased was Anton Tiefenbach. He studied theology in Gießen before he fell ill. I was even able to find in the Gießen matriculation records from 1664 his name. So here you can see it on this sheet. Wiedemann herself stated that he had not only been her patient, but also her fiancé, which his family later denied. When she had to testify before the council about his death, she accused 2 barber surgeons who had been called to the patients by his relatives. When the patient became increasingly unwell, she accused them of being responsible for his death. The barber surgeons then charged Wiedemann not only with the lack of medical knowledge and slander, but also with witchcraft. The council dropped the charge of witchcraft, but a decree was issued by the alderman expelling Wiedemann from the town. However, after many patients requested permission to continue to be treated by her, she was allowed to provide care for her patients until 1676. When disputes between the barber surgeons, the physicians, and Wiedemann arose again in 1675, the council finally gave in to the demands of the physicians and barber surgeons in 1676 and expelled Anna Margaretha Wiedemann from the town. After that, her traces are lost. The documents relating to this case are very extensive. There are several statements from the healers, statements from the barber surgeons, and also statements from their patients themselves. A total of approximately 59 patients are listed. In some cases, the identification of individual persons is not entirely certain, so this is only a rough figure. Of these, 23 were women, 20 men, and 17 children, all people without their own households. I have analyzed the research literature of German-speaking countries and Frankfurt sources to find some analysis of the gender ratio of patients of surgeons to compare it with. However, due to a lack of sources, it is only rarely possible to draw up such lists. Among the testimonies of 7 patients of the surgeon Melchior Seifert, who was accused by the Frankfurt Barber Surgeons Guild in 1736, 4 were children, 3 sons and 1 daughter. 1 was a woman and 2 were men. Alexander Kästner has analyzed a list of patients of the Saxon executioner Johann David Zipzer, who together with his wife treated patients. A total of 28 patients can be identified, 9 of whom were women. The practice diary of the Cologne surgeon Gerhard Eichhorn, died in 1657, painted a different picture. Of the 60 patients treated between 1625 and 1638, 80% were male and just 10% female and 10% children. The fact that sick women in the early modern period apparently sought out female healers more frequently is explained in the literature on the one hand by the fact that they were ashamed to be treated by men, especially in the case of diseases of genitals. However, Catherine Walker also summarizes, for example, that early modern surgeons usually advised surgical removals of the breast if cancer was diagnosed in the breast. This was the case because the symptoms usually only appeared at a very advanced stage of the disease, and the women only sought medical treatment very late out of fear of surgery and possible also out of embarrassment. Healing women like Wiedemann, by contrast, appear to have used less painful therapies, such as ointments and plasters, as we will see below. It is difficult to make a statement about the size of early modern surgery shops. Unfortunately, I cannot give any information at all about Frankfurt barber surgeons. The Cologne surgeon Gerhard Eichhorn states in a defense that he treated over 200 patients in 1 year. So this was 1633, 1634. This has been analyzed by the historian Robert Jutte. Unfortunately, due to the lack of sources, it is not possible for me to judge whether Wiedemann's circle of patients was average and usually large or small. I once marked the indicated places of residence of the patients on this map of Matthias Merian from 1628. The children are marked in yellow, the women in green and the men in purple. Even if only a small number of patients' accommodations are recorded, this map reveals quite a bit about their social status. We mainly find maids, domestic workers, and journeymen who lived in the alleyways around the old market square in the old town. Some came from Sachsenhausen, which is located right across the river, where very poor people lived in the 17th century. Even though the people Wiedemann treated included, for example, also a courtier and high-ranking citizen who did not wish to be named according to one letter, it seems to have been mainly craftsmen as well as poorer people who sought her help. There were 24 statements about the cause of the disease and the healing process made by the patients themselves or their relatives. These are very interesting as they provide a glimpse into how people from different social backgrounds understood their bodies and illnesses. And this is something we really rarely have in the early modern sources, so I would like to outline the results of my research below. The physical condition of being ill was understood in very different ways in the 17th century. Until very late in early modern period, academic medicine took illness in humoral pathological terms, for example, as an imbalance of humors. However, Michael Stolberg's work with sources on everyday medical practice revealed that the idea of a disease-causing substance was much more prevalent. In other words, a substance that was absorbed into the body through unhealthy food or was produced in the body itself and then had to be removed. However, a look at the German Encyclopedia Johann Heinrich Zedlers großes vollständiges Universallexikon aller Wissenschaften und Künste from 1754 offers an even more comprehensive understanding of disease. Illness is generally everything that is troublesome for the body, in particular an unnatural condition of the human body or one of its parts, which prevents or inhibits its performance. In addition to this physiological level, the definition of illness chosen by Zedler also refers to the bodily sensation and experience of illness, such as pain and physical limitations in the case of broken bones and wounds caused by accidents or experience of violence. I think it will become clear in the following that it is precisely these aspects, for example, physical pain or the sensation of pain and physical limitation, that were particularly present in the endurance of illness and healing. This is shown, for example, by the case of Anna Katharina Herbst. She had been suffering from dropsy, dizziness, and weakness, as well as intense pain in her liver and spleen for some time. A physician advised her to take a medicinal bath to ease her symptoms. However, the bath she got into was far too hot and she burned the whole left side of her body and her right foot. Wiedemann then cared for her burns. Her patient particularly emphasized in her testimony that the healer treated the burnt and painful skin without instruments, using only ointments and plasters. Wiedemann therefore did not use any painful surgical methods. Even though the patient died during the course of her illness, as it is started later on in the file, her husband praised Wiedemann's work in a statement after his wife's death. He also emphasized in particular that she had treated her dying patient without pain. Because the woman died contrary to a prognosis previously made by Wiedemann. But even though the widowed husband still considered the treatment to be successful, for when it became clear that the woman would soon die, the aim of the treatment was apparently adapted to the circumstances. So the aim was now to allow the patient to die with as little pain as possible. We can also see how the understanding of healing, health, and successful treatment influenced the expectations that patients had of the healers. In the course of treatment, these expectations could also change. A look on the Frankfurt sources reveals a wide range of different expectations of the treatments, which depended strongly on the patient's physical complaints and levels of suffering. Even if the treatment goals were not always named and described in detail, they often appear in the explanations of why they were satisfied or dissatisfied with the work of healers. First, it is very often stated the healer helped and relieved the patient with her remedies. However, it is not described in detail what exactly this was like. For example, the butcher's widow Katharina von Kaben states that the so-called Speckbeutel on her daughter's neck were happily cured by Anna Margaretha Wiedemann within 4 weeks. So in early modern Germany, tumors as well as tumor-like growth like boils and abscess and so on were referred to as Speckbeutel, which is why there are always contradictions about the diagnosis in the sources. So there was, so I can find a lot of disputes between Wiedemann and the barber surgeons, whether it is cancer or tumor or a Speckbeutel. Secondly, in the case of apparently chronic or long-term illnesses, certain conditions of wounds were described that were to be remedied by the treatment. For example, the 7-year-old son of Councillor Johann Witzel had 3 boils at the beginning of the cure, 1 on his hand, 1 on his cheek, and 1 on his eye. And it seemed that the healer did not actually promise a complete cure. The child's history of suffering was already very long, as he had been treated by other healers for 6 years without any success. When, after 15 weeks of Wiedemann's therapy, only 1 boil was left, the parents were very satisfied. In addition to the physical complaints, the aesthetic appearance of the wound could also be a source of suffering for the patients. Anna Elisabeth Deigle, for example, stated that Wiedemann's medication made her look like an ordinary person again. She had been suffering for several years due to damage to her nose, which had previously been treated by various barber surgeons without success. In addition to aesthetic purpose, the intended healing process could also be linked to physical abilities, which the treatment would restore. This is shown by the testimony of Anna Clara Bockin, who had been bitten by a cat and suffered injuries to her finger as a result. She stated that she was satisfied with Wiedemann's work as she was able to heal her wounds to such an extent so she could use her hand to perform her work for the municipal writer again. Thirdly, the patient stated that Anna Margaretha Wiedemann had relieved or completely overcome their pain. The clockmaker Caspar Willenbrand described this particularly impressively when questioned by the notary Johann Georg Schroth. His young daughter had suffered an injury to her shoulder and had not wanted to eat or drink anything all winter because of the pain. The father's statement, who was extremely emotional about the girl's poor health, testifies to this great concern for his daughter and also to the hardship of seeing his child suffer so much. A Frankfurt barber surgeon first advised to open the injury and treat it with caustic substances. However, this caused the damage to get worse and worse. In addition, the child was so frightened by this procedure that, I quote, lamented very much in front of the notaries who took the statement and did not want to show the damage at all. But when the parents said that we were not barber surgeons, she let us see the damage. After Wiedemann cured the girl with her ointments, the father reported that she was no longer in pain and had regained her appetite and was cheerful. Willenbrand saw this improvement in his daughter's condition as the successful outcome of the provided medical care. I find this very interesting as the barber surgeons wanted to testify their skills and high qualifications by using these very instruments in performing surgical procedures, sometimes in more, sometimes in less details. And this is quite contrary to the statements and feelings of the patients in this trial records. A brief example of this is a dispute between the wounded soldier Kapitän Hans-Joachim von der Osten and the barber surgeon Johann Kropphäuser. The conflict arose because the patient withheld the barber surgeon's wedges. He justifies this by claiming that he was dissatisfied with the treatment as his leg had not been completely healed. Von der Osten had suffered a gunshot wound to his knee in 1635. In an extremely long report, Kropphäuser gives a detailed account of his own work on the patient. He repeatedly emphasizes the dangerous situation that the wound meant for the patient and his own willingness to intervene at any time of day or night, using his knowledge to save the soldier's life. It is striking to note the brutal visualization Kropphäuser repeatedly uses to describe the nature of the wound in a statement. The wound began to be quite painful to look at, and the necessity forced me to open the skin in 2 different places due to the gangrene and the approaching synovial fluid. Furthermore, he had surgically removed the wound from the wound 36 pieces of bone and lead. And after an initial improvement, the patient's condition worsened again. And he blew over his leg and on the wall so that he and I were in great fear, the barber surgeon wrote. One can certainly imagine how painful the repeated surgical removal of lead and bone splitters must have been. And it was also surprising for me to read how explicitly the barber surgeon describes his procedure here. After all, it is completely contrary to the patient's desire for a pain-free therapy and their understanding of healing as a progressive absence of pain. However, it is important to note to whom the barber surgeon was making his statement here, namely to the council as the city authority who determined the responsibilities and scopes of action of the healers. I would therefore take the description of this medical expertise as a proud demonstration of his professional status as a surgeon. Through such dramatic depiction, he was able to demonstrate his professional competence on the one hand, but also his willingness to take responsibility for his patients at any time of day or night. A demand on the Frankfurt surgeon, which, by the way, can also be found in the official guild regulations of the barber surgeons. To what extent the Frankfurt barber surgeons recognized this dilemma and how they handled it remains unanswered in the sources reviewed. However, as soon as they had to defend their treatment practice in front of the city authorities, they illustrated their skills and high qualification in varying degrees of detail by using the very instruments and practicing surgical procedures that their patients describe in contrary as extremely brutal in their statements. This behavior of the Frankfurt barber surgeon seems to have been a widespread practice in early modern surgery as a whole. This is also illustrated, for example, by the Wundarztneuisches Zeughaus by the Ulm town physician Johann Skultetus, published in 1666. The illustrations you see here on this slide visualize the amputation of a female breast in 5 figura. And the accompanying text shows very clearly that Skultetus was well aware of the patient's fears of the surgical procedures and pain. He even instructs the barber surgeons not only to keep the patients unaware of the upcoming surgery, but even to deceive her with a hidden knife in order to carry out the treatment. For this reason, the surgeon should attach a girdle ring to the index finger of the right hand and, without the prior knowledge of the patient or those around him, as he were planning to do something else, open the tumor with a small curved knife concealed in the girdle ring. Skultetus naturally also constructs a certain relationship between practitioner and patient and assigns very clear roles to both sides. The patient, who instinctively fears his pain but has no expertise to realize what intervention needs to be undertaken to help him. And opposite him is the surgeon, who, due to his medical expertise, must take responsibility for his patient by deciding or having to decide in his favor, even against his will. The patient and surgeon are therefore by no means on an equal footing. This self-conception of barber surgeons seems to have repeatedly led to conflicts with their patient in their daily lives. However, I would like to emphasize at this point that in the case of the Frankfurt barber surgeons, I only came across examples of relationships between barber surgeons and patients that ended up in dispute. So unfortunately, the many satisfied patients of the Frankfurt barber surgeons are not documented. Nevertheless, allow me to draw some conclusions from the previous observations. Anna Margaretha Wiedemann seems to have at least provided, due to her ointments and plasters, alternative healing methods to patients who had previously been treated by barber surgeons. Although she considered herself as a surgeon, her surgical interventions are not documented. On the one hand, this may simply derive from the fact of her lacking the essential anatomical surgical skills. It also is possible she was not trained in these practices, although this can only be speculated on. But on the other hand, however, it should be noted that as an unmarried woman, she was excluded from the guild's medical profession. And at the same time, she was not bound by the prescribed healing methods of the early modern surgery or the Frankfurt surgeons. So the surgical removal of bone splinters and flesh from wounds, which are described in many statements by Frankfurt barber surgeons and their patients, also appear in Johannes Scultetus' textbook as a central practice of 17th century surgery. Many of the medical instruments he described were used for exactly these procedures. For example, Scultetus describes the use of nasal forceps. This flat and wood cutting instrument also serves to remove the supernatural flesh. Even though I'm not an expert on early modern healing methods and remedies, I was able to find many of the Frankfurt barber surgeons' documented interventions in exactly these 17th century textbooks on surgical medicine. Therefore, my impression is that they practiced according to the knowledge recognized at that time. In the reasoning behind their professional politics towards other practitioners and to the municipal council, the current level of knowledge by contemporary standards played a major role in their ability to assert their status and competence with the medical system, as already mentioned. Wiedemann did not have to act in this way in terms of professional politics. As a healer and non-gilded woman, as the case files show, the first important factor in her being allowed to practice was the contentment of her patients. Her independence from the barber surgeon skills did not only allow her to refuse the prescribed healing methods, it also made it necessary for her to refrain from using therapies her patients did not agree. Opening a wound without the knowledge and consent of the patient, as described in Scultetus' textbook, would have endangered her patient's trust in her and her curing. The relationship between Anna Margaretha Wiedemann and her patients was therefore largely determined by the expectations and demands of the patients and their relatives, which the healer had to fulfill. This means that the patient's need for a share in decision-making and an equal balance of power could be fulfilled maybe better by Wiedemann than by the barber surgeons. Thus, the relationship between practitioners and patient was strongly influenced by institutional involvement or independence, which were linked to categories such as gender, level of knowledge, healing methods, etc. It is therefore perhaps less surprising that competition for the favor of patients appears as the central object of conflict in the barber surgeon's complaints. They accuse her of bad-mouthing her reputation among patients and argue in very general terms that she was a quack doctor. Only a few practitioners complained about her ointments and plasters. For example, the physician Dr. Schombart, who also visited Tiefenbach before his death. He stated that Wiedemann's ointment soaked in vinegar had caused the patient wounds to bleed too much, that whoever takes my blood in such a form takes my life. Rather, it is true of such a weak and feeble person, he wrote. The fact that the records include only a few professional accusations against Wiedemann may also be to the fact that she followed widely accepted contemporary recipes when preparing her ointments and plasters. So it seems to me, having looked up some of her remedies and herbal books. Her incompetence was justified more by her gender, the absence of her institutional training paths, and her origins. Last but not least, I would like to summarize the observations presented here. The case of Anna Margaretha Wiedemann clearly shows that her patients' understanding of illness, healing, and health were closely linked to the pain sensations and physical abilities. For this reason, they accepted medical cures to reduce pain quickly. This is in line with the findings of other medical historians such as Robert Jutte and Hannah Newton. However, contemporary knowledge and methods of surgical medicine often required painful surgical procedures to heal wounds. Patients' demands, which appear in the trial codes, were therefore always opposed to the surgeon's repertoires of treatments. This seems to have been a central cause of conflict between healers and their patients in everyday medical practice in Frankfurt. As a female healer, Wiedemann was not bound by institutional knowledge, healing methods, and professional representational practices, as were the male professional barber surgeons. She was therefore presumably able to satisfy the demand for pain-free therapies by treating with ointments and plasters rather than surgery. For earning her income, however, she was certainly also dependent on responding to these wishes in order to gain the favor of her patients. Wiedemann's treatment practices therefore appear to have been shaped not only by her own education, knowledge, and skills. The needs of her patients probably had a much greater influence on her choice of treatment methods than it seems to have been in the case of male surgeons. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions and feedback now.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Jana, for this well-researched and comprehensive talk, which I'm sure will arise several questions in the audience. I see a few faces that have studied midwifery and early modern surgery keenly and deeply.